Some of you may have even seen my video I recently got made, which I'm actually going to play now, and I think it's sort of a good introduction to one viewpoint on the scalability question. So here, let's give this a go. And go.
You all know Bitcoin. It's our secure, inflation-proof, decentralized currency. You make a transaction and it gets published to the global Bitcoin network. Bitcoin nodes all around the world forward that information to each other, until seconds later the whole world knows about your transaction. Every node, even yours, validates the transaction and ensures it follows all the rules. Bitcoin has a built-in limit of 1 megabyte of data per block, or 7 transactions per second. The transaction then goes onto one blockchain. As you know, Bitcoin has become very popular. Unfortunately, supply and demand will cause fees to increase over time, which means small value transactions just won't be practical. The easy thing to do is just have everyone change their software to accept bigger blocks all at once. Fees would go down, but you will need an expensive data center to run a node, and you won't be able to do it anonymously. Mining pools will be forced to close due to rising costs and regulations. What's left are large, powerful and regulated pools controlling what transactions happen at all. Doesn't that look like banking today? This is not the Bitcoin we know and love. We have an alternative to increasing the block size: off-chain transactions. The block size stays the same, and mining stays decentralized. You'll still use the blockchain for large transactions. Small exchanges will be handled by payment processors, which means small purchases like your morning coffee don't clog the whole system up. We can use the very same cryptography that makes Bitcoin secure to audit off-chain payment systems, as well as effectively make it impossible to get away with fraud or theft. Imagine a plexiglass bank where you can easily observe the inner workings. Unlike the completely public blockchain where you can't pick who mines your transactions or who you trust to do validation, off-chain transactions can be both instant, truly private, and you have complete control over who to trust. What can you do to keep Bitcoin decentralized? If you're a miner, only mine at pools that support the block size limit and ask your pool to publicly say so. If you are a user, ignore anyone trying to change the Bitcoin software you use to increase the 1 megabyte block size, and tell people you transact with that you support keeping Bitcoin decentralized and out of the hands of the existing corporate system. Remember, Bitcoin is democratic, and the only way the block size can change is if we agree to let that happen.
And of course, that's one viewpoint, and it's my viewpoint, but it's a fairly extreme viewpoint. But what's I think is most interesting about it is the decisions that it's talking about aren't really technical decisions. They're decisions that are influenced by technology, but at the same time, they say a lot about what we want Bitcoin to be. First and foremost, I mean, Bitcoin does scale. You know, people know very well that you can get hardware that'll happily process 10,000 transactions a second. And what's interesting is, of course, you know this because MasterCard exists. They do exactly that, and apparently their backend actually looks kind of like Bitcoin in the way it operates in a peer-to-peer manner. What it comes down to is what block size you pick, how much data you need to process to be part of the system, really comes down to a validation versus access trade-off. And you kind of get sort of two competing models at the extremes. One where you've got a small number of nodes with a very large number of people connected to them, or one where you've got a very large number of nodes and everyone's participating. But because of the scaling problem, if you go by that route, you must find some way to do small value transactions. You know, you can only do 7 per second. And then that kind of comes down to, well, if you pick something in between, it's interesting too, because as an example, in the US, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of banks. Yet you wouldn't go call that a decentralized system, you'd call it a distributed system. Because each one of those banks, fundamentally they're large enough that they're known to regulatory authorities, and, you know, reality is they go follow the same set of laws, or in the case of some of it, same set of 1 to 50 laws. But if you're not doing a transaction on the blockchain, then you run into a lot of trust issues, because fundamentally someone's acting as an intermediary. And trust is very interesting because in the normal world, identities are well known. You can go after people, you can enforce laws. There's a lot of very good existing mechanisms to deal with trust. I mean, like it or not, PayPal, Western Union, you may not necessarily agree with their policies, but to the extent that their policies may be something you don't like, they do follow them. And when you go put $5 into PayPal, you can be pretty sure that either you'll be able to get it out or they'll have a reason why. And another curious example is you get strange just like the Silk Road, where you don't necessarily know who they are, but they have enough of a reputation by just being around and doing what they do. Another interesting thing to think about is, well, why can I trust Bitcoin itself with my coins? And if you run a node, your computer audited the blockchain. Or if you, say, have an Android client or some other SPV node, what you're really trusting is that someone else did it for you. And that's a very safe assumption, because it's the same assumption that at least a majority of hashing power you can trust that Bitcoin depends on itself. But it's not necessarily perfect. When we don't do that, our track record sucks. Let's be honest here. Insta wallets, My Bitcoin, Tor wallet, it goes on and on and on, and people go and screw up and lose people's coins, or in the case of Tor wallet, just outright steal them. And one way to start solving that is with auditing. I'm not going to talk too much about that many technical details, but I thought it'd be good to go through this one, because it's a nice, simple example that can give you a feel for how these auditing technologies work. Here, you kind of have the problem. Let's suppose that you've trusted Easy Wallet or Insta Wallet or whatever with your Bitcoins. The latter wouldn't have been a very good decision, by the way. And you want to know, do they still have those Bitcoins in their vault? And what you see here is what's called a Merkle sum tree. Well, let's suppose you have Alice, Bob, Charlie, and David, and they all have accounts. You can then, using the same kind of tool as Bitcoin itself uses for transactions, sum up the accounts in such a way that you eventually lead up, and you see at the top some hash representing the values of all those accounts. And in the intermediate levels, you sum up the account amounts. This sounds kind of obscure, but lets you do something really interesting. It lets you go prove that the account summary that Easy Wallet or whatever said existed and said publicly actually matches up to your account. And in conjunction with that, then they can go off and sign a message using the private keys to the Bitcoins they hold, proving that they, if not own the Bitcoins per se, they do possess the ability to access the private keys, which in Bitcoin is effectively equivalent to owning them. And because it's compact proof, well, you get something else interesting. Now I can go and tell the world. And this isn't unlike, when, well, PayPal is an example. When they do things that people consider fraud, they go complain on forums endlessly and, they tell the world. And people, to some degree or another, decide that PayPal is trustworthy. And you can do the exact same thing with Bitcoin. And for that matter, information is easy to spread and hard to censor. That's really the fundamental security assumption that Bitcoin has itself. Is you've got this transaction information that everyone must be able to go see, to go audit. And if there's any competing information, like there's actually a majority of miners that you don't know about, you want to be sure you get that. So this mechanism of proving fraud acts, along those same principles. The thing is, well, what do you do with that? I mean, if it turns out you were trusting Tor wallet with your Bitcoins, it doesn't really do you much good. You can call fraud all you want, but who cares? So you can do something else kind of interesting. Because Bitcoin is cryptographic, you can deliberately make your identity expensive to obtain. In this case, a man who I'm not really sure I recognize, he appears to be burning some money. And looks to me he's proving he's destroying some money, thereby whoever he is going and making his identity more valuable. Well, in this case, the proof's kind of a bad one, because if you look closely, it doesn't really look like the money's on fire. And it's not necessarily easy to go validate, well, who exactly is that? I don't know, I think his name's Gavin or something. But as I say, with Bitcoin, it is cryptographic, so we can start doing much more robust things than that. There's various ways to go create transactions that ensure that you do not possess some Bitcoins anymore and it's linked to some identity that you pick. I'll name a few. You can, they're up on wikis and whatnot. Anyone can spend output, sacrifice via fees, and announce commit. But what they all boil down to is you're kind of sort of writing a check that can't be cashed until tomorrow. And anyone at all can, it's a blank check, anyone at all can take that money. And because it's Bitcoin, anyone can go publish it and take that money. And it's signed by some anonymous identity. And provided you can go prove that everyone had an equal opportunity of getting that, you really have thrown away money and you've made your identity expensive. Which leads to, you can have something I call fidelity bonded banking, where you combine the fraud detection proofs, the fidelity bonds, and you kind of end up with this interesting structure where, not unlike Bitcoin itself, you incentivize people acting honestly. Let's go back a second to the blockchain. If you're a miner, why do you mine honestly? Why do you mine on the end of the chain? It's because when you do so, there's an incentive in that you have some chance of getting a block, getting some free money, getting some transaction fees, whatever. Similarly with this scheme, you have an incentive to behave honestly, because the moment you don't, someone can just publish, well, hang on a second, you signed this message saying that I deposited some Bitcoins, would you please, give them back to me? And if you don't, I'm going to tell the world and they're never going to trust you again. So, potentially, you could use this to allow you to trust someone else with your money, even though you don't know who they are. And on top of that, you can use another interesting technology called trusted computing. And IBM is well known for this, as well as smart cards, and Mintchip is a more recent example, Canadian Mint's payments system. Long story short, you have this piece of hardware that's supposedly tamper-resistant. Sometimes they'll call it tamper-proof if marketing is getting a little out of control. And the idea with this piece of hardware is it generates private keys within itself. So they only exist within this tamper-proof box. And with remote attestation, the manufacturer adds this mechanism to it by which you can ask it, well, all right, what software are you running? And it goes and signs the code and says, yes, no, this really is the software I'm running. And provided the software running this bank or whatever happens to be honest, you can say, well, yeah, I have this assurance that my coins really are there and they can't be spent otherwise. And in conjunction with other stuff, there's always security is a set of layers. In conjunction with other protections, I can probably go and trust that third party with my morning coffee funds. And finally, I'll give a quick talk about some other approaches to other ways of doing transactions without involving third parties. There's Ripple, there's this open transaction software. I won't mention that too much. It's quite involved. And then you get some interesting schemes which are kind of hybrids, where Jeremy Spillman, just a few weeks ago, made an extension on a scheme that Mike Hearn's been working on and that Satoshi himself's been working on, where essentially you have two parties and the two parties want to, over time, decide how much money the other party has from the first party. So you get Alice and Bob, and Alice wants to send money. And Alice keeps on signing incomplete transactions with increasing amounts of coins. And at any point, Bob can decide, well, all right, I'm happy with this. I'm going to sign the other part, get the coins, and that's that. Turning what could be, thousands of transactions into one. And you also get another interesting set of possibilities called probabilistic payments, where, going back to Bitcoin mining, when you mine a Bitcoin share, you can go and prove to someone else, yes, I really mined a share, and I'm in a position where my incentives are to broadcast that block should I find one. And it just happens to be that if I were to do this successfully, you would get some Bitcoins, because one of the destination addresses for the inflation reward happens to be, Bob. And you just continue to prove them, yep, I made an honest attempt to go make you some money. And maybe 1 out of 1,000 times or whatever, it'll actually go through. And what's curious about that is there is no trust really involved. Similarly to the micropayment channels, there's very little or no trust involved. So, got some approaches there. But then you also have a lot of interesting legal issues. I mean, PayPal is a good example where, when PayPal started, they had this vision of changing the world's financial system. Funny how that didn't quite turn out. But they thought, I'd be able to send PayPal money all over the world with no friction, no one in between. And like it or not, regulations started coming about, and now it's it can be quite limited as to where you can send a PayPal payment. And you also see the FinCEN guidance, where it looks like they have made it pretty clear that a system where you go hold someone else's Bitcoins is probably regulated. So, to go say that kind of can be a solution to scaling, it may work fine for the users of the Silk Road who just don't care. But will it work fine for coffee shops around the world? Who knows? It's kind of a really big cloud over this stuff. And of course, if FinCEN was being clever about it, they would be thinking, well, hang on a second. If transactions go on the blockchain, we know where they are because it's public. We have very good reasons to incentivize keeping them that way. So, if I were them, I wouldn't be very supportive of anyone trying to do transactions any other way. Which, that's a problem. But above all, too, the big idea with this is it really gives you options. We don't know really what's going to happen in the future. We don't know how scalable Bitcoin really will be. We don't know what people will think about the trade-offs. I mean, my first slide, or second slide, I went and show how fundamentally you kind of got to decide at what point can you go run a Bitcoin node given how much hardware you have. And where that point will be depends on how many transactions there are, which depends on how popular Bitcoin gets, which can change very quickly. I'm not going to say I really know the future. So having options, I think, is very good. Whether or not they get used or what form they'll take or how far they can go, it's hard to say. But at least it's that option. And going and talking about this stuff earlier, I get the impression there's going to be a fair number of questions and whatnot, so I'm really curious to see what you people are thinking and where that goes. So, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so take the mic. I'm Michael. I agree with a lot of things you said around the size of the chain and the things, but I'm actually disagree with the problem that if you don't constrain the size of a block to 1 megabyte, you would get a setup where you have either huge computer centers mining or no one. I think there's a completely other way. So instead of keeping the entire blockchain, you could use an augmented data structure, and you can keep only the unspent outputs, and you can put them into a DHT, which is perfectly viable. And that setup you can have keep the same properties, but also increase the block size.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned distributed hash tables, because I think one thing you got to ask yourself is, well, have you used them before?
Yeah.
They're not that reliable.
Oh.
And Bitcoin has a really nasty problem where if you don't have access to the full validation data, it's very easy to construct a block that is invalid, but you don't know it. You know, someone can go and construct a block that happens to have one transaction, that has one input, that doesn't actually exist. And then they go and make sure that their nodes are the majority on the DHT. And, oh, what do you know? You just can't get that. You either say, well, I can't validate this, I'm going to give up. Or you say, well, I'll just validate it anyway, and you find out 3 blocks down the road it doesn't work.
But that's not possible if you have an authenticated data structure. Then you can't lie about what's there and what's not there, even though you have a majority of the
Sorry,
DHT.
authenticated what?
You can't lie about the facts. You can't lie about what kind of unspent output you have or not. Not if you have an augmented data.
Oh, what unspent outputs? Well,
Yeah.
first of all, let's go say the UTXO proof stuff that people have been talking about. None of that's actually been implemented, but none of this off-chain stuff's been implemented either for the trust. So there's a bit of both there. But it does have a lot of nasty failure modes where, for instance, you have a bug in this, and you're fundamentally talking about code where it rarely gets tested because it's only there to detect fraud. And you've got an active attacker trying to go and make it fail. So, you know, you implement something like this, and you usually wind up with a bug, for instance, that, oh wait, we didn't actually detect that fraud, and it only showed up 10 blocks down the road, or, you know, a day later, and then suddenly, well, now what do we do? Do we just, you know, let it slide? Do we let it go? It'll be interesting seeing where that goes, and I don't have good answers to that. And, you know, I think you can kind of say in general with this off-chain stuff, I think you can call it a conservative option in the sense that if you find out it doesn't work, you can always increase the block size later. You can't go the other way around necessarily if you can't convince people to do the reverse.
Okay.
Also, with the DHT, you can DOS one block, and that DOS is the entire...
It depends on how you put things together. It's not true. It depends on how you put things together. We can discuss that later.
Can you talk a little bit more about how much bond would be required for a given service? For instance, I can envision a kind of any bank where there's less bond than the total deposits would have some potential incentive to walk away with some of those deposits.
No, I think that's a very, very good point. You know, you're exactly right. Provided that's the only mechanism by which you're trying to make fraud, give a disincentive to fraud, you know, you really would have to have a bond equal in value. You know, you can probably go make that work for lots of very small payments, but I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where the majority of us around here, for our savings, for our larger amounts, are not using the blockchain directly. And similarly, you know, when Bitcoin scales the part where you want to do that, you would probably say, yeah, no, it is okay to increase the block size now. Bitcoin's huge. You know, a lot of the issues aren't as important. Now, with with trusted computing stuff, that's, I think, a very nice example where then you can go use other guarantees to go say, well, all right, IBM says it's going to take about $1 million worth of work to get the private keys out of that. So that bond can be much smaller to try to go and dissuade them from doing something. It's, you know, and by doing something in that case, it's really simply shutting down the service. I mean, after all, nothing can stop someone from just unplugging it.
I almost understood that, but I didn't quite. So, if I work out that example, you're running a service, the entire computer can be stolen.
Yep.
If your bond is less than the amount of deposits, then customers would lose money, but you're saying at least the service provider has an incentive not to let it get stolen.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. In the exact same way that miners have an incentive to mine on the correct chain.
Right.
You know, this is a different type of security guarantee, and there's no getting around it. So you're basically making a trade-off between, do you want to go have the decentralization of the system itself in exchange for some degree of centralization for small payments, or are you willing to risk some amount of centralization of the base system in exchange for less centralized payments? And you know, that's a decision I think the community needs to start thinking about, because it is a trade-off.
So one other consequence would be, if we are using bonds, since the bonds for a bank would have to nearly equal its deposits, and since that could be very hard to achieve, what we would probably end up seeing is more of us would take care of our own balances, and there would be another pressure to keep prices down by taking care of your own assets.
Sorry, to keep what down?
I'm assuming that maintaining the bonds would increase the price of banking. Therefore, we would all have an incentive to improve our software and keep our own coins safe.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And you know, you want to go have options with that, and you do create those incentives. Similarly, you do create incentives for trusted hardware stuff to go and reduce the need for that, as well as more conventional systems where, yeah, you know who's operating this. It's not some anonymous, you know, completely anonymous service. And let's be honest here, I suspect there's going to be a lot of the non-anonymous services and the options where more conventional systems work fine. You know, this is sort of giving, well, what's the farthest we can push this technology?
Thanks.
I have a quick question.
I think we're done now.
Oh, okay. Are you able to answer one more?
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah. Basically, so I know like the whole
you want to set up? Let's.
The whole system of Bitcoin is decentralized, but the rule itself is centralized. Every people who like join this system should obey this rule. As I see, like as the system getting updating and updating, there may be like, oh, it turns out to be more difficult to get one Bitcoin, or later on when something is scalable, then it's more easy to get a Bitcoin. How can we make sure the value of Bitcoin could be like protected?
I'll answer at least one part of that quickly. It's very interesting to hear Gavin earlier on talking about the potential for having scheduled hard forks every, say, 6 months, which is sort of a very centralized development environment where the rules of the system itself, you know who's making the decisions for that. And though, of course, you have to agree to do it, there's sort of a social incentive too. So, you know, that's an interesting trade-off too. And you are quite right. In some ways, the core software, you sort of call it centralized. In other ways, we call it, yeah, it's consensus that this is the right thing to do. But anyway, I should let the next person on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Expensive data center to run a node, and you won't be able to do it anonymously. Mining pools will be forced to close due to rising costs and regulations. What's left are large, powerful and regulated pools controlling what transactions happen at all. Doesn't that look like banking today? This is not the Bitcoin we know and love. We have an alternative to increasing the block size: off-chain transactions. The block size stays the same, and mining stays decentralized. You'll still use the blockchain for large transactions. Small exchanges will be handled by payment processors, which means small purchases like at pools that support the block size limit, and ask your pool to publicly say so. If you are a user, ignore anyone trying to change the Bitcoin software you use to increase the 1 megabyte block size, and tell people you transact with that you support keeping Bitcoin decentralized and out of the hands of the existing corporate system. Remember, Bitcoin is democratic, and the only way the block size can change is if we agree to let that happen.
And of course, that's one viewpoint, and it's
Your morning coffee don't clog the whole system up. We can use the very same cryptography that makes Bitcoin secure to audit off-chain payment systems, as well as effectively make it impossible to get away with fraud or theft. Imagine a plexiglass bank where you can easily observe the inner workings. Unlike the completely public blockchain where you can't pick who mines your transactions or who you trust to do validation, off-chain transactions can be both instant, truly private, and you have complete control over who to trust. What can you do to keep Bitcoin decentralized? If you're a miner, only mine.
Some of you may have even seen my video I recently got made, which I'm actually going to play now, and I think it's sort of a good introduction to one viewpoint on the scalability question. So here, let's give this a go. And go.
You all know Bitcoin. It's our secure, inflation-proof, decentralized currency. You make a transaction and it gets published to the global Bitcoin network. Bitcoin nodes all around the world forward that information to each other, until seconds later the whole world knows about your transaction. Every node, even yours, validates the transaction and ensures it follows all the rules. Bitcoin has a built-in limit of 1 megabyte of data per block, or 7 transactions per second. The transaction then goes onto one blockchain. As you know, Bitcoin has become very popular. Unfortunately, supply and demand will cause fees to increase over time, which means small value transactions just won't be practical. The easy thing to do is just have everyone change their software to accept bigger blocks all at once. Fees would go down, but you will need an